Hold for 10 more minutes. That's all Lieutenant Colonel Kahalani had left, 10 minutes before his 6 remaining tanks would be overrun by hundreds of Syrian T-62s on the morning of October 9, 1973. What happened in those 10 minutes defied every rule of modern warfare and became known as the miracle of the Valley of Tears. But to understand how Israel reached this impossible moment, we need to go back to where it all began. At 13:55 on October 6, 1973, the silence of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, is shattered by the concussive roar of 655 Syrian artillery pieces opening fire simultaneously across the Golan Heights. For the soldiers of the 7th Armored Brigade and the 188th Barak Armored Brigade, the earth does not merely shake, it erupts. The bombardment, synchronized with a massive aerial assault by over 100 Syrian aircraft, targets Israeli command centers, vehicle parks, and the fragile line of fortifications known as the Purple Line. Inside the turret of his shot Kal, an upgraded British Centurion tank, Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Kahalani watches as the volcanic plateau of the Golan transforms into an inferno. The air smells of cordite and burning oil. The ground vibrates like the heartbeat of some monstrous god. Just days prior, Israeli military intelligence had been gripped by what they called the conception, a strategic assumption that Syria would not attack without Egyptian air superiority, and that Egypt would not attack until 1975. This intelligence failure results in a catastrophic disparity in forces. As the artillery barrage lifts, the dust settles to reveal a sight that defies military logic. Approximately 177 Israeli tanks face a mechanized avalanche of nearly 1,400 Syrian armored vehicles. The odds are 8-1. The Syrian offensive, codenamed Operation Al-Auda, the Return, is executed with rigid adherence to Soviet doctrine. 3 infantry divisions, the 7th, 9th and 5th, each reinforced with armored brigades and hundreds of T-54 and T-55 tanks, surge forward in a multi-echeloned assault intended to overwhelm the Israeli defenses through sheer mass. Behind them looms the second echelon, the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions equipped with modern T-62 main battle tanks tasked with exploiting the breakthrough and seizing the bridges over the Jordan River. For the Israeli commanders, the strategic reality is terrifyingly simple. The Golan Heights offers no strategic depth. Unlike the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan is a narrow plateau, varying from 12 to 26 kilometers in width. A breakthrough here means Syrian armor descending into the Galilee and threatening Israeli civilian population centers within hours. The defending forces are not fighting for territory. They are the only physical barrier preventing the destruction of what Defense Minister Moshe Dayan calls the Third Temple, a code word for the State of Israel itself. There is no fallback position. There is no retreat. Lieutenant Colonel Yair Nafshi, commanding the 74th Battalion in the northern sector, orders his tanks to the ramparts, preparing earthen firing positions designed to allow the Centurions to fire from a hull-down position. From these vantage points, Israeli gunners, trained to engage targets at ranges of up to 3,000 meters, begin to fire upon the advancing Syrian engineering vehicles. The Centurion's 105mm L7 rifled cannon proves devastatingly accurate, destroying bridging tanks and mine-clearing vehicles long before the Syrians can effectively return fire. The crack of the cannon is sharp, violent. The recoil slams the turret backward. Brass shell casings, still scorching hot, clatter onto the steel floor. Each shot turns a 30-ton vehicle into a fireball visible for kilometers. But the sheer volume of Syrian armor begins to tell. While the Israeli gunnery is superior, they cannot be everywhere at once. In the southern sector, the terrain is flatter, allowing the Syrian 5th Division to push hard against the outnumbered 188th Brigade. In the north, at the critical Quneitra Gap, a natural corridor between the Hermanist and Booster Ridges, the 7th Armored Brigade faces the spearhead of the Syrian 7th Infantry Division. As the sun begins to set on the first day of fighting, the tactical situation shifts from precarious to critical. The Syrians, realizing their engineering equipment is being decimated, make a ruthless command decision. Syrian officers order their tank crews and mechanized infantry to dismount and bridge the anti-tank ditch, a 5-meter deep trench spanning the front under heavy fire, or simply push vehicles into the ditch to create bridges for the following waves. Men scream as high explosive shells detonate among them, tearing bodies apart. But the wave keeps coming. What the Israelis don't realize is that the Syrians are willing to spend lives like currency to buy those precious meters of ground. As twilight fades into darkness, reports crackle over the Israeli radio networks that send chills through the command staff at Nafak. The anti-tank ditch has been breached in multiple locations. The Syrian armor is no longer held at bay. They are crossing the line, and the Israeli tanks, lacking night vision equipment, are about to be plunged into a battle against an enemy that can see in the dark. What they do not know is that the nightmare is just beginning. The onset of night on October 6th transforms the Golan Heights from a long-range gunnery range into a claustrophobic nightmare for the Israeli tankers. The psychological strain on the crews of the 7th Armored Brigade is immense. They have been operating on high alert, many fasting for Yom Kippur, and are now thrown into high-intensity combat against a numerically superior foe. But as darkness envelops the plateau, a technological asymmetry threatens to undo the 7th Brigade's defense. The Syrian T-55 and T-62 tanks are equipped with active infrared night vision systems. This Soviet technology allows Syrian gunners and commanders to visualize the battlefield and engage targets at ranges of roughly 800 meters in the dark. By contrast, the Israeli shotshell tanks are blind. They lack night vision sights, forcing commanders to fight with their hatches open, exposing themselves to artillery shrapnel and sniper fire, merely to spot the muzzle flashes or silhouettes of advancing enemy armor. One commander will later describe it as fighting with a bag over your head while someone throws knives at you. Avigdor Kahalani, positioned in the chaotic sector north of Kunitra, realizes that his battalion's survival depends on negating this technological advantage. He orders his tanks to hold fire until the Syrians close to within 800 to 1,000 meters, a terrifyingly close range for armored warfare. The strategy is a gamble. Allow the massive enemy formation to approach unmolested in the hopes of executing a devastating close-range ambush. Inside the Israeli tanks, the loaders, handling 105mm rounds that weigh over 20 kilograms each, work in the cramped turrets, surrounded by the smell of cordite and sweat. Their hands bleed from handling the rough metal. The darkness presses in like a physical weight. To compensate for their blindness, the Israelis improvise. They utilize 81mm mortars mounted on their tanks to fire illumination rounds, and call for artillery flares to light the battlefield. The flares arc through the sky, bursting into brilliant white light that casts stark shadows across the valley. Israeli commanders resort to using the enemy's own infrared searchlights as targeting beacons. When Syrian tanks turn on their infrared projectors, they appear as distinct light sources through handheld infrared binoculars, allowing commanders to direct their gunners onto the targets. The battle devolves into a series of confused, close-quarter melees. Lieutenant Zvika Greengold, commanding a single tank and later a small ad hoc force known as Zvika Force, engages the Syrian 1st Armored Division along the Tapline Road. Changing tanks as they are disabled and constantly moving to simulate a larger force, Greengold engages Syrian T-55s at ranges as close as 30 meters, using the darkness and the confusion of the enemy to delay an entire armored division. His voice over the radio is calm, almost clinical, as he calls in fire missions. But inside his tank, the heat is suffocating. The diesel fumes mix with the smell of hot metal and burning rubber. His hands are blistered. Blood seeps from cuts where shrapnel has sliced through his uniform. He is fighting a war of deception, a single man holding back a tide of steel. But he knows his luck cannot hold forever. In the northern valley of Tears, the 7th Brigade fights to hold the ramparts. Syrian tanks, guided by their infrared equipment, managed to bypass Israeli positions, infiltrating behind the defensive lines. The chaos is absolute. Israeli tanks find themselves intermingled with Syrian columns. In one instance, Kahalani and his wingman identify a tank with its taillights on. Unsure if it is friend or foe, they illuminate it with the xenon searchlight, revealing a T-55 less than 100 meters away. The Israeli gunner fires. The Savat round punches through the Syrian tank's turret ring. The enemy vehicle erupts in a geyser of flame, the ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that light the valley like a strobe. The turret is blown 50 feet into the air before crashing back to earth. Despite the heroism of individual commanders, the sheer weight of the Syrian assault begins to fracture the Israeli coherence. The 7th Brigade's ammunition is critically low, and fatigue is eroding the cognitive abilities of the crews. Tank commanders hallucinate from exhaustion, seeing ghost tanks in the smoke. But what they do not know is that their worst fear is about to materialize. Just as Kahalani manages to stabilize his line, the sun begins to rise on October 7th, revealing a horrific new reality. The daylight exposes the valley floor littered with hundreds of burning Syrian vehicles. However, looking through their optics, the Israeli commanders see a dust cloud rising in the east. The Syrians are not retreating. Instead, they are committing their strategic reserve. The elite 81st Armored Brigade, equipped with the formidable T-62 tanks, is joining the assault, and they are bringing the heavy 180mm artillery and SAM-6 mobile missile batteries with them. The second wave is here, and this time the Syrians are bringing everything. If you're gripped by this story of impossible odds and want to see more epic battles from history, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. By the morning of October 8th, the Valley of Tears had earned its name. The terrain between Mount Hermonite and the Booster Ridge is a graveyard of armor, choking the narrow corridor with the wreckage of the Syrian 78th Armored Brigade. Twisted metal, burned corpses, and unexploded ordnance litter the ground. Yet, the Syrian determination remains unbroken. Brigadier General Omar Abrash, commander of the Syrian 7th Infantry Division, prepares a renewed offensive designed to crack the Israeli line once and for all. Abrash recognizes that frontal assaults against the Israeli ramparts are too costly. He orchestrates a combined arms attack involving heavy artillery saturation and flanking maneuvers. The Syrians concentrated their efforts on the gap between Hermonite and Booster, utilizing the cover of the Wadi's dry riverbeds to close the distance before exposing themselves to Israeli fire. This time, Abrash is convinced the line will break, from the perspective of the Israeli 77th Battalion. The onslaught is relentless. The Israeli tactic of shoot and scoot, firing from a hull-down position on the rampart and then reversing down the slope to reload and relocate, is the only thing keeping them alive. The superiority of the 105mm L7 cannon is critical here. Its flat trajectory and high-velocity armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds can penetrate the frontal armor of the T-55s and T-62s at combat ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. However, the Syrian T-62s field the 115mm smoothbore cannon, which fires armor-piercing fin, stabilized discarding sabot rounds capable of destroying a Centurion with a single hit. When a sabot round hits, it sends a jet of superheated metal through the crew compartment, incinerating everything inside. As the battle rages, the 7th Brigade's commander, Colonel Avigdor Kahalani, realizes that his southern flank is crumbling. To prevent a total collapse, he orders his reserve force, Tiger Company, commanded by Captain Mir Zamir, to execute a holding action. Zamir does not merely hold. He sets a complex ambush. Positioning his 7 tanks in concealed positions overlooking the enemy's advance route, Zamir waits. A Syrian tank battalion, estimating 30 to 40 vehicles, advances confidently, unaware of the Israeli presence. Zamir holds his fire until the enemy column is fully inside the engagement zone. At his command, the Israeli tanks open fire, destroying the lead and trail vehicles to trap the column. Zamir's small force decimates the Syrian battalion, destroying nearly all enemy vehicles for the loss of 2 tanks. The valley echoes with the thunder of cannons. Syrian tank commanders bail out of their burning vehicles, screaming as their uniforms catch fire. However, tactical successes are becoming overshadowed by strategic exhaustion. The 7th Brigade is bleeding. Casualties among officers are catastrophic. Platoon and company commanders are being taken down or wounded at an alarming rate, forcing non-commissioned officers to take command of ad hoc formations. The physical and mental toll of 48 hours of continuous combat means crews are operating on adrenaline and muscle memory alone. In the afternoon of October 8th, a glimmer of hope appears. A shell hits the command tank of Syrian General Omar Abrash, ending his life instantly. The loss of Abrash creates a temporary command vacuum in the Syrian 7th Division, causing a lull in the coordinated attacks. But the reprieve is short-lived. The Syrian General Headquarters commits the Republican Guard and the 3rd Armored Division to resume the offensive with fresh vigor. On the morning of October 9th, the Syrians launched their heaviest barrage yet, a creeping barrage of artillery that walks up the Israeli ramparts, forcing the tank commanders to button up their hatches, effectively blinding them. The barrage is a wall of fire and steel. 130mm shells detonate in rippling waves, each explosion throwing up geysers of dirt and rock. Under this curtain of fire, a massive force of T-62s from the Republican Guard surges forward. As the smoke clears, Kahalani looks out to see that the Syrians have not only breached the ditch, but have climbed the plateau. The Israeli ramparts are overrun. Kahalani's radio crackles with reports from his flank. The Syrians are behind them. The 7th Brigade is now fighting inside an encirclement, intermingled with enemy armor, with no reserves left to call upon. This is where the state of Israel lives or falls. The morning of October 9th represents the nadir of the Israeli defense. The 7th Armored Brigade has effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting unit. It is reduced to a handful of operational tanks. Some estimates suggest as few as 6 to 7 tanks under Kahalani's direct command remain on the primary defensive line. The Valley of Tears is a churning cauldron of smoke, burning steel and the thunder of high-velocity cannons. The air is thick with the acrid stench of burning rubber, diesel fuel and searing flesh. Inside the Centurions, the noise is deafening. The mechanical whine of the turret traverse, the roar of the Continental diesel engine, and the terrifying clang of hits on the armor plate create a cacophony of violence. Tank commanders, eyes stinging from smoke, scream orders over the intercoms, their voices cracking from exhaustion. The Syrian Republican Guard, engaging with T-62s, presses their advantage. These tanks begin picking off the remaining Israeli defenders. Ben Gal, realizing the desperate situation, orders the remaining tanks to withdraw to a secondary line to regroup, but the retreat threatens to turn into a rout as exhausted crews begin to pull back too far. The line is disintegrating. At this critical juncture, Lieutenant Colonel Kahalani makes a decision that will become legendary in armored warfare history. Recognizing that losing the high ground means losing the Golan, he orders the retreating tanks to stop and turn back. "Do I see cowards here?" he bellows over the battalion network. When the tanks hesitate, Kahalani moves his own tank forward alone, charging back up the rampart toward the advancing Syrian wave. He crests the ridge and immediately engages 3 Syrian tanks at point-blank range, 50 meters. His crew destroys the first, the sabot round tearing through the glacis plate. Then the second, the turret exploding off the chassis. As they target the third, the cannon jams. The breach refuses to close. The Syrian tank traverses its turret toward them. Yet, seeing their commander's suicidal charge, the other Israeli crews rally. They surge back up the ramparts, tracks throwing up showers of sparks, and unleash a volley of fire into the stunned Syrian vanguard. Simultaneously, a ghost force arrives on the flank. Lieutenant Colonel Yossi Ben Hanan, who had been on his honeymoon when the war started, had cobbled together a makeshift force of 13 repaired tanks from the workshops at Nafak. Many of these tanks are manned by wounded crewmen who have discharged themselves from field hospitals, their bandages still soaked with blood. Ben Hanan's force strikes the flank of the Syrian advance at the crucial moment. The battle devolves into a chaotic, close-range slugfest. Ranges drop to meters. Tanks ram each other, steel grinding against steel. Machine weapon fire sweeps the decks of vehicles. The Israelis are firing their final rounds. Some tanks are down to machine weapon ammunition only. The valley is a hellscape. The ground is littered with shell casings. Burning tanks send black smoke into the sky, blotting out the sun. Men scream. Metal screams. The 7th Brigade is spent. Kahalani reports to Ben Gal that they can no longer hold. Ben Gal implores him to hold for just 10 more minutes. But 10 minutes is an eternity in tank warfare. As Kahalani prepares for the final overrun, scanning the valley for the next wave that will surely overwhelm them all, he watches the Syrian line waver. A massive force of fresh Syrian T-62s, poised to deliver the final blow, suddenly halts. But what happens next defies all military logic. The Syrians stop, and then, impossibly, they begin to reverse. The collapse of the Syrian offensive on the afternoon of October 9th remains one of the most debated events of the war. To the battered crews of the 7th Brigade, it appears as a miracle. The Syrian tanks, hundreds of them, begin to reverse. Strategic analysis reveals the retreat is caused by a confluence of Israeli tenacity and Syrian systemic failure. The Syrians have lost over 260 tanks in the Valley of Tears alone and nearly 600 across the Golan front. The loss of General Abrash has paralyzed their command structure. Furthermore, the arrival of Ben Hanan's small force on the flank convinces the exhausted Syrian commanders that the Israeli strategic reserves have arrived in force, when in reality, the reserves are a handful of broken tanks and wounded men. The Syrian officers, staring through their optics at the dust clouds kicked up by Ben Hanan's 13 tanks, see what they expect to see, an entire armoured division. It is the greatest bluff in military history. The silence that descends on the Valley of Tears is heavier than the roar of battle. The valley floor is a graveyard of armour. Over 500 armoured vehicles, including 260 T-55s and T-62s, lay burning or abandoned. The 7th Armored Brigade has paid a horrific price. Of the 105 tanks that started the battle, only 7 to 20 remain operational. The brigade suffered dozens fallen and hundreds wounded. The 188th Brigade has been effectively destroyed, its commander Colonel Ben Shoham lost in action. The immediate aftermath sees no rest for the weary. By October 11th, the Israel Defense Forces, having fully mobilized its reserves, launches a counter-offensive. The remnants of the 7th Brigade, refitted and reinforced, lead the push across the Purple Line and into Syria proper, advancing to within 40 kilometers of Damascus. This strategic reversal forces Syria to request urgent aid from Iraq and Jordan, widening the conflict but securing Israel's northern border. The Battle of the Valley of Tears leaves an indelible mark on military history. It validates the modern system of defensive warfare, emphasizing hull-down positioning, long-range gunnery, and the autonomy of small unit leadership. The freedom of action granted to commanders like Kahalani and Zamir stands in stark contrast to the rigid command structure of the Syrian army, proving that in the chaos of modern war, initiative is more valuable than mass. What do you think made the difference in this battle? Was it superior training, better equipment, or the human will to survive against impossible odds? Let us know in the comments below. Today, the rusted hulks of T-62s still dot the Golan Heights, silent monuments to the desperate struggle of 1973. The miracle was not divine intervention, but the terrifying resilience of the human spirit when backed against the abyss. The Valley of Tears was a testament to what human beings can endure when the alternative is annihilation. The 177 tanks held the line against 1,400. If that deserves a like, hit the button. If it deserves to be shared, you know what to do. Thank you for watching.